My son hadn't answered my calls for 2 weeks, so I decided to stop by his house quietly. When I got there, I noticed something moving under my grandson's bed. When the police lifted it, what we found left everyone in absolute shock, because I still remember the chill that ran down my spine, a cold dread that clenched my guts so tightly I could barely breathe. What I found that night wasn't just a missing person, it was a shattered life, a horrifying secret, and the silent scream of an innocent child. On that fateful day, I took the first bus heading to Chicago, my heart hammering against my ribs. The 3-hour ride was a blur of silence, my eyes fixed on the blurring landscape outside the window, my soul twisted in a knot of agonizing worry. I told myself to calm down, but my hands trembled uncontrollably as I clutched the bus ticket. By the time I stepped off at the main terminal, the city lights were already beginning to pierce the growing darkness. I walked quickly, almost ran, toward Daniel's gated community, each familiar step now heavy, leading me further into what felt like a waking nightmare. I stood before the familiar wooden door, the one I'd knocked on countless times before to visit Daniel and my precious grandson, Matthew. I knocked gently at first, then with increasing urgency. Daniel. Matthew. I called out, but my voice broke in the cold evening air, swallowed by the silence. No one answered. Just on a whim, a desperate hope, I reached for the doorknob. To my horror, it turned with a soft creak. Unlocked. My heart leaped into my throat, pounding 1,000 beats a minute. Daniel was meticulously careful, he never, ever left the door unlocked, especially with Matthew at home. Pushing the door open, I stepped inside, holding my breath, as if the slightest noise might shatter whatever fragile peace remained. The scene that greeted me froze me in place. The living room was a battlefield. The sofa was violently pushed aside, as if someone had thrown it in a fit of pure rage. On the floor, a coffee mug lay in 1,000 porcelain shards, glinting menacingly amidst a dark, dried coffee stain. My legs trembled as I carefully stepped over it, terrified of what I might find next. The kitchen was just as bad, the water cooler jug tipped on its side, empty plastic bottles scattered and uncapped, as if someone had desperately chugged them down. The smell of dampness mixed with an unsettling silence that sent a shiver straight through me. I forced myself to go upstairs, each step a monumental effort, like dragging stones. My heart hammered so loudly I could hear it echoing in my ears. Daniel's home office was empty. His bedroom was empty too, the bed still neatly made, but with no sign of life. Finally, I reached Matthew's room. Matthew, where are you, sweetie? I called, my voice hoarse with fear. Still no answer. I stood in the middle of his room, my gaze sweeping over his toys, the Lego blocks, his old teddy bear, and felt an unbearable ache in my chest. My heart was about to break. Then, a tiny noise. A faint scraping sound from under the bed, like a plastic bottle rolling on hardwood. I froze. A profound chill snaked down my spine. My heart, already a frantic drum, now threatened to burst out of my chest. There was something under the bed. I wanted to bend down, to see, but my feet felt glued to the floor. Taking a shaky step back, I grabbed the edge of the desk, trying to steady myself. Matthew? I called again, my voice barely a whisper. Only silence answered, punctuated by that tiny, clear sound, a warning. Panic, raw and unyielding, took over. I ran out of that house, my hands shaking so violently I fumbled the phone 3 times before finally dialing the police. My son is missing. I haven't heard from him in 2 weeks. I practically screamed into the receiver, my voice cracking with desperation. There's a strange noise under my grandson's bed. I stammered, barely understanding my own words, just knowing I needed help, and I needed it fast. In less than 10 minutes, the flashing red and blue lights of a patrol car illuminated the windows. I led the 2 police officers back into the house, my hand shaking as I pointed a trembling finger at the bed. Under there. I whispered, too afraid to look myself. A tall, young officer knelt down, his voice firm but gentle. Is anyone under there? A heavy, suffocating silence filled the room. Then, without another word, the 2 officers lifted the bed in one swift, coordinated motion. And there he was. Matthew. Curled up, hidden beneath, so thin, his hair matted with sweat, his clothes filthy and reeking of something sour. He was clutching an empty water bottle, his eyes wide and expressionless, staring into a world I couldn't reach. I stood there, paralyzed, my heart feeling like it had simply stopped. The officers were equally stunned, wordless. I fell to my knees, desperate to hug him, but my hands shook so terribly I didn't dare. Matthew, my boy, I whispered, tears blurring my vision. He didn't respond, just clung to that empty bottle as if it were the only thing keeping him alive. I didn't know what nightmare he had endured, but I knew, with a horrifying certainty, that this was only the beginning. My name is Helen, and I'm 61 years old. I live a quiet life in a small town not far from a major Midwestern city. My story, this whole nightmare, truly began one morning in late October. That's when I first realized Daniel was gone. What followed were 2 eternal weeks, each moment a fresh wave of anxiety, with no answers in sight. On that first day, I called Daniel, just like I always did. I was sitting at my kitchen table, phone in hand, listening to it ring and ring until it clicked over to voicemail. No answer. I sent him a quick text, "Are you okay, son?" But the message just sat there, undelivered. A knot tightened in my stomach. Something felt wrong. But I told myself he was probably busy, maybe his phone battery died, or he was somewhere with no signal. Daniel was a fiercely independent man, always doing his own thing. I tried, desperately, to calm my worries. But in the days that followed, that worry grew, a slow, insidious fire burning inside me. I called him at all hours, at dawn, late at night, even at noon, when I knew he usually took his lunch break. Always, just silence. I left voicemails, my voice trembling. "Daniel, where are you? Call me, please. I'm so worried." But they, too, vanished into the void, no sign he'd ever heard them. I started imagining the worst. Daniel wasn't the type to just vanish without a word. He called me every week, like clockwork, telling me about his job, about Matthew, about the small, normal moments of a father and son. This silence was utterly unlike him. By the 5th day, I couldn't take it anymore. The anxiety was eating me alive. I tried his landline, hoping to hear his voice, or at least Matthew's, my 8-year-old grandson who loved to chatter about school. But I only heard the phone ring and ring in an empty house until I finally hung up. I opened up that messaging app the kids use and typed a message to Matthew, "Sweetie, where are you? Call Grandma." The message sent, but the read receipt never appeared. My heart sank. Matthew is young, but he's savvy with a phone, and he absolutely adored his grandma. He always replied immediately. Next, I started calling Daniel's friends and coworkers. Their voices were hesitant, surprised. "I haven't seen Daniel all week," a coworker told me. "I thought he was on vacation." A close friend said, "The last time we talked was last month." Daniel mentioned he was swamped with work. No one knew anything concrete. The more I asked, the more I felt like I was drowning in a sea of questions with no answers. Daniel was a dedicated father, a loving son. Something terrible had to have happened. On the 10th day, I just couldn't bear the waiting any longer. I looked up the numbers of Daniel's neighbors, calling everyone I could find. They sighed on the other end, their voices heavy with pity. An elderly woman, Mrs. Rose, who lived across the street, told me that the previous week, on the night of the big storm, she'd seen a light in Daniel's house suddenly turn on and then off. "I thought the boy just turned on the light to go to bed," she said, but her voice trembled, betraying her own unease. Her words pierced me like a knife. The night of the storm. A light on, then off. Something was profoundly, terrifyingly wrong. I was sure of it. 2 weeks dragged on, and all my desperate efforts were in vain. Not a message, not a call, not a single sign. I couldn't sleep. I spent my nights staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with terrifying possibilities. Had Daniel been in an accident? Kidnapped? Or had he simply chosen to disappear? No, that couldn't be it. Daniel would never, ever leave Matthew. Matthew was his whole world. And Matthew, my sweet grandson, where was he? The more I thought, the more I felt suffocated. I couldn't just stand by for another minute. I had to go to Daniel's house myself. And what I found there only intensified my anguish. Now, I'm sitting here in the dim light of a hospital room, my hands gripping the edge of the chair so tightly my knuckles are white, as if letting go would make the whole world collapse. Matthew lies in the bed, his small body almost swallowed by the crisp white sheets. A police officer carried him in his arms from that cold, empty house, and I, like a soulless shadow, ran after them. My hands trembled as I reached out to touch him, desperate to hold him, but terrified I might squeeze too tight, might hurt him even more. Matthew didn't react. Not a flicker in his eyes, not a sigh. His small hands still clutched that empty water bottle, as if it were the last anchor to this life. The patrol car had sped through the dark city streets, the siren's wail echoing in the night. I sat beside Matthew, fanning him with a piece of paper I'd found, gently patting his back. "Matthew, Grandma's here," I'd whispered, my voice broken. But the boy remained a living statue, his eyes wide open, staring at nothing at all. I tortured myself, wondering what on earth had happened to my grandson, to Daniel. That ransacked house, the empty water bottle, the scraping noise under the bed. It was all a nightmare I couldn't wake from. At the hospital, doctors and nurses whisked Matthew into the emergency room immediately. I stayed outside, my hands pressed against the glass door, watching them move with frantic speed around him. The mechanical beeps and hums mixed with the hushed, hurried voices of the doctors. No external injuries, severe malnutrition, severe dehydration, signs of psychological trauma. Every word was a fresh stab to my heart. Psychological trauma. My 8-year-old grandson, that boy who always smiled like the morning sun, was now a mere wisp, a dry leaf that could blow away at any moment. A little while later, the doctor allowed me in. Matthew was already on IVs, a thin tube connected to his skinny arm. His eyes were still open, but they weren't looking at me, they were fixed on some distant, unseen place, a place I couldn't reach. I took his cold little hand and called his name. "Matthew, it's me, Grandma. Wake up. Please, say something." But he didn't respond. He didn't even blink. I sat beside him on the bed, and the tears, hot and relentless, began to fall. I remembered the days when Matthew was tiny, running wild in my yard, laughing with unbridled joy, asking me to tell him stories about my own childhood. Now, that infectious smile was gone, replaced by a terrifying silence, as if my grandson had locked his soul away. The police arrived shortly after, notebooks in hand, their faces serious. A young, grave-looking officer sat next to me. "Ma'am, could you tell us when you last had contact with Mr. Daniel?" I shook my head, a lump forming in my throat. "It's been 2 weeks," I managed to say, my voice trembling. "I called him. I sent him messages. I did everything, but nothing. Daniel would never do something like this. He always called me at least once a week." The officer jotted down notes, nodding, then turned to speak quietly with the doctor about Matthew's condition. They spoke in low tones. "The victim shows no life-threatening injuries, but he's in a state of severe post-traumatic shock." Hearing those words, I felt a stone crush my chest. Post-traumatic shock. What horror had Matthew endured to end up like this? I wanted to scream for answers, but the officer simply took more notes and told me, "We're opening a missing person case. Could you come with us to the precinct to give a full statement?" I shook my head, almost begging. "Let me stay with my grandson. I can't leave him alone right now." They nodded, agreeing, but their eyes were filled with a shared concern, as if they, too, felt the dark shadow hanging over my family. That night, I sat by his bed, watching Matthew tremble as he slept in fits. He clutched the empty water bottle tightly, even in his sleep, as if terrified someone would take it from him. Sweat beaded on his forehead, soaking the pillow. Occasionally, he would jolt awake, his eyes wide with terror, but he never said a word. He just looked at me with that empty gaze. I gently wiped his forehead with a small towel, my hands still trembling. "Grandma is here with you," I whispered, though I knew he couldn't hear me. The doctor came to check on him, a kind-faced, middle-aged woman. She placed a comforting hand on my shoulder. "Ma'am, the boy needs time. He went through a huge shock. Be patient. You'll see, he'll tell us what happened." I nodded, but a terrible heaviness settled in my heart. Patience? How could I be patient when Daniel was still missing, and Matthew was here, a mere shadow of his former self? I spent the entire night sitting there, holding Matthew's small hand, listening to his shallow breathing. I remembered the last time I spoke to Daniel on the phone. His voice had sounded tired, but he still managed to laugh. "Mom, I'm fine. It's just that work has been a bit heavy." I hadn't realized just how heavy. I hadn't asked more questions. Now, I blamed myself. If I had paid more attention, if I had called sooner, would things be different? 2 days crawled by, and I didn't budge from Matthew's bedside, as if taking my eyes off him for a second would make him disappear entirely. He was still there, small and fragile, his thin hands now clutching a teddy bear a kind nurse had given him. I tried to feed him some broth, spoonful by spoonful, bringing it to his mouth, praying he would eat something. "Eat, Matthew, sweetie, so you can get strong and come home with Grandma," I whispered, my voice trembling. But the boy barely swallowed a couple of spoonfuls before clamping his mouth shut, his gaze fixed on the ceiling. Every night was the same. Matthew was plagued by nightmares. Sometimes he would sit up suddenly in bed, his mouth open as if trying to scream, but no sound would come out. I would hold him, rock him gently, and sing him the lullaby I used to sing to Daniel when he was a baby. But Matthew would only tremble, sweat drenching his forehead. I'd wipe his brow, my hands shaking so much the washcloth would often fall. I asked for a psychologist, and a young woman with a wonderfully soft voice came. She sat next to Matthew, held his hand, and asked him gentle questions. Matthew, do you want to tell me something about your dad, or about anything you saw? But the boy just hugged his teddy bear tighter, his eyes fixed on the floor, utterly silent. I stood to the side, my heart lodged in my throat. Will he talk again, doctor? I asked, almost pleading. The psychologist looked at me with deep compassion. Ma'am, he needs time. The shock was too great for a child, but I'm sure he will open up. It's just not the right time yet. I nodded, but inside, I couldn't find any peace. Time. I didn't know how much time I had left to wait, with Daniel still missing. Every passing day was an agony of anguish and pain. On the morning of the third day, I was gently cleaning Matthew's face, wiping a damp cloth over his thin cheeks. I tried to smile and began telling him an old story about Daniel, about how he, as a boy, had once broken one of my vases and tried to tape it back together. Your dad was so silly, Matthew, I said softly. But he loved you more than anything in the world. Matthew didn't respond, but I saw his small fingers squeeze the teddy bear, clinging to it like a lifeline. I was about to continue when the phone in my purse vibrated violently. The caller ID showed the police precinct. My heart leaped, a terrible premonition washing over me. I answered, my hands shaking so much I almost dropped the phone. The detective's voice on the other end was grave, a stark contrast to his usual calm demeanor. Mrs. Helen, I need you to prepare yourself. We just used luminol to re-examine Mr. Daniel's house, and we found a very large amount of blood in the living room. My ears went numb, as if the world had suddenly gone silent. The washcloth slipped from my hand and fell to the floor. I couldn't feel my own hands. Blood? I repeated, my voice barely a whisper, broken and raw. The detective continued, and each word was a knife plunging deeper into my heart. It's very likely we're dealing with a homicide. The crime scene has been cordoned off pending DNA results. I was barely processing what he was saying, the words not fully registering. Then, Matthew tugged hard on my sleeve. I turned, and saw his small face, his red, tear-filled eyes, as if he had heard everything. And then, after so many days of agonizing silence, Matthew burst into tears. A heartbreaking, gut-wrenching cry that shattered the calm of the hospital room. Dad, he's dead, he screamed, his voice weak, but full of a pain that felt as ancient as the earth, as if his entire world had just collapsed. I fell back into the chair, hugging him with all my strength as tears streamed down my own cheeks. No, Matthew. No, it's not like that, I told him, but even I didn't believe my own words. Those few words from his lips had been a hammer blow to my heart. Matthew's cries were loud enough to carry through the phone, and the detective spoke quickly. Ma'am, calm down. We're on our way to the hospital right now to take an initial statement. Please don't move from there. I didn't answer. I just hugged Matthew tighter, letting my tears soak his clothes. Nurses and doctors rushed in, surely alerted by the crying. A young nurse knelt beside me, placing a hand on my shoulder. Mrs. Helen, stay calm. Let us take care of the boy. But I shook my head, holding Matthew even closer. No, I have to be here with him, I choked out. I couldn't leave him, not now, not after he had just spoken those horrific words. The doctor checked Matthew and gave him a mild sedative to calm him down. Slowly, his crying subsided, but his eyes remained red, looking at me with a profound pain I knew I couldn't soothe. I stroked his hair, whispering, Grandma's here, Matthew. I'm not going anywhere. But inside, I felt like I was falling into an endless abyss. If Daniel was really... I couldn't even dare to finish the thought. I remembered the last time I saw my son, when he had visited me in my small town, bringing me a sweet corn cake that I loved so much. Mom, take care of yourself, okay? He had said with his bright, open smile. Now, that smile felt like a distant memory, erased by the detective's words and Matthew's heart-wrenching cries. An hour later, the detective and another officer were at the hospital, with a recorder and a notebook. A young, tall, slim police officer sat by the bed and spoke in a soft but careful voice. Matthew, can you tell us, with your grandma here, what happened? I felt Matthew tremble in my arms, his thin little shoulders tensing up. He lowered his head, clutching the teddy bear in his hands as if holding on to it for dear life. I stroked his hair and whispered, "It's okay, Matthew. Just tell us. Grandma is right here with you." I tried to make my voice sound calm, but inside, I felt like I was teetering on the edge of a cliff. I was terrified of what he was about to say, but at the same time, I desperately needed to know the truth, no matter how painful. After a few minutes of agonizing silence, Matthew nodded slightly. It was a movement so small it broke my heart anew. I held my breath, squeezing his shoulder, and listened to each of his weak, broken words, as if each one was a shattered piece of his soul. That night, it was raining really hard, Matthew began, his voice trembling, almost a whisper. I was playing with my Legos in my room, building a really tall tower that Dad said was the prettiest. And then the doorbell rang, many times. Matthew paused, looking down at his bear, squeezing it tighter. I got curious and went to see. Dad was at the door, looking through the peephole, and his face was very tense. I'd never seen him like that. A chill ran down my spine. Daniel was always so calm, always knew how to hide his worries to protect Matthew. What on earth had scared him so much? Matthew continued, his voice growing quieter. Dad turned around and saw me standing there. He ran to me, knelt down, and whispered, "Matthew, get under the bed quickly. Don't come out until I call for you. You hear me?" I was scared, but Dad pushed me toward my room in a hurry. I got under the bed, and Dad even pulled down the comforter to cover it so no one could see me. I pictured my little boy, only 8 years old, huddled under the bed in the dark, not understanding what was happening, and my heart ached with a pain almost too great to bear. Through a little gap in the comforter, Matthew continued, I saw my mom come in with a very tall man. That man's face was very cold. He didn't say anything. He was just standing there with his arms crossed behind my mom. I was frozen. Jessica. Matthew's mom. Daniel's ex-wife. I never thought she would come back, or rather, that she couldn't come back after everything that had happened. Matthew trembled, and his voice broke. My mom looked all around the room and asked, "Where is Matthew?" I got so scared. I thought she was going to find me. But my dad told her, in a calm voice, he went to his grandma's when the winter break started. I knew Dad was lying, but I didn't dare to move. Hot tears rolled down my cheeks. The police officer didn't stop writing, his expression serious, but I saw his hand pause for a moment when Matthew continued. Then my mom started yelling at him. She was asking Dad for money. She said something about a debt that Dad had to pay if he didn't want trouble. But Dad shook his head and wouldn't give her any money. He told her she had gone too far, that she had bothered him enough. Hearing that broke my soul. Daniel had tried so hard to escape Jessica's shadow. He had tried to build a new, peaceful life for himself and Matthew, but she had come back, bringing all her troubles with her. Matthew stopped, breathing heavily, as if the memory was dragging him back to that night of terror. I gently rubbed his back and whispered, "Take it easy, sweetie. Grandma is here." The boy took a deep, shaky breath and continued. "Dad." My mom and the tall man started fighting really bad. My mom was screaming, and the other man got closer, saying something like a threat. I didn't hear it clearly, but I saw him push my dad. Dad stumbled back, and then he pushed him harder. Dad fell, and he hit his head on the corner of the table. There was a loud thud, and red water started coming out. Matthew trembled uncontrollably, burying his face in my chest, and burst into fresh tears. I saw Dad lying there not moving. I wanted to come out. I wanted to call him, but I was scared. I was so scared. I hugged him with all my strength, my tears soaking his hair. The image of Daniel falling, hitting his head, replayed in my mind like a terrifying nightmare. The police officer in front of me stopped writing and looked at me with profound compassion. "This statement is very important, Mrs. Helen," he said in a grave voice. "We are going to investigate this as a possible homicide. The boy has been very brave." I nodded, but inside, I felt an emptiness that nothing could fill. Matthew kept crying, his sobs like sharp knives in my heart. I looked at the officer and said with a choked voice, "Are you going to find her? About Jessica and that man?" He nodded firmly. "We will do everything possible, Mrs. Helen. I promise you." When the police left, I stayed there, hugging Matthew, feeling the suffocating shadow of tragedy that had just fallen upon my family. That night, after the police left, I couldn't sleep a wink. Matthew's soft sobs echoed in the room like constant stabs to my heart. He moved his lips in his sleep, calling for his dad, his voice so faint I had to lean in close to hear him. Each time, I would gently wipe his face with a warm cloth, desperate to soothe even a little of the pain he carried. But as I touched his cold skin, old memories came rushing back, hurting me as if someone were pouring salt on a wound that had never truly healed. I remembered Daniel when he was in his 20s, his career just beginning, his eyes shining with faith in the future. I remembered the pride in his voice, the smile that shone like the summer sun, when he introduced me to Jessica. "Mom, this is Jessica," he'd said, his voice brimming with love. "She's going to be my wife." Jessica back then was a good girl, a little clumsy, but always trying her best. She would blush when I taught her how to cook. I truly believed, yes, this girl is good. She's going to make Daniel happy. The whole family adored her, not just for her warm smile, but for the way she looked at Daniel, as if he were her entire world. Then Matthew was born, and it was as if a new light had been lit in our family. I can still picture the day I carried him in my arms, walking around the yard, his round little eyes looking at me with a wide grin. The neighbors would joke, "Mrs. Helen, you look 10 years younger." And I would laugh, my heart overflowing with joy. Daniel and Jessica were still happy then. They would visit me often, bringing Matthew and their stories of their beautiful new life. I thought it would always be like this, that our small family would always be full of laughter. But then, everything started to fall apart. I remember the day I got a call from Daniel. His voice was dull, weary. "Mom, Jessica, she got into some gambling trouble." I froze. I couldn't believe that sweet girl had fallen into something like that. The first time, Daniel quietly sold the car he loved so much, the car he had saved for years to buy, just to pay off his wife's debts. I saw him sitting in the yard, his eyes red, but still trying to smile. "Mom, I'll be fine. I just want to help her." I took his hand, wanting to say so much, but I stayed quiet, understanding that Daniel loved Jessica so much he was willing to do anything to save her. But things didn't stop there. The second time, debt collectors came knocking on my door, making threats because Jessica couldn't pay. I had to take out all my life savings. It was the money I had saved for my old age, but I didn't hesitate. I just wanted to protect my family, my son. "Mom, I'm so sorry," Daniel told me that night, his voice choked with shame. I didn't think things would get to this point. I hugged him, telling him not to worry, that family was for supporting each other. But inside, a deep fear began to grow. Jessica was no longer the good girl she used to be. Every day that passed, she changed more. Jessica became irritable, capable of breaking plates over the smallest thing. I remember one time I went to visit and saw Matthew huddled in a corner, his eyes red because his mom had yelled at him just for spilling a glass of milk. Jessica was standing over him, screaming, "You're just as clumsy as your father." I rushed over and pulled Matthew away, trying to calm her down, but she just laughed bitterly. "He's my son. I know how to raise him." Those words were like a stab in my heart. Matthew didn't deserve to endure those fits of rage. I looked at Daniel, and I saw him consumed by it all, his eyes that once shone now reflecting only exhaustion and utter helplessness. Many nights, Daniel would call me, venting through his tears. "Mom, I can't take it anymore," he'd whisper, his voice trembling. "Jessica is not the woman I fell in love with. I'm afraid she'll hurt Matthew." Hearing him broke my soul, but I could only console him, "Son, if you need me, I'm here. I'll help you." Finally, Daniel decided to divorce and fight for full custody of Matthew. The day the judge made the ruling, I saw him sigh in profound relief, as if an unbearable weight had been lifted from his shoulders. I felt the same way. I thought that finally, father and son would have a quiet life, that Matthew would grow up with Daniel's unwavering love, without any more shouting or crushing debts. But I was terribly wrong. Barely half a year later, Jessica returned, bringing with her a nightmare far, far worse. Matthew's story, about that stormy night, about how Daniel fell and lay motionless on the floor, kept replaying in my head. Jessica, the woman I once loved like a daughter, the mother of my grandson, had transformed into a stranger, a cruel, heartless person. Sitting in the darkness of the hospital room, I watched Matthew sleep, and I heard him sob, his lips still moving to call for his dad. I made a solemn promise to myself then, "Daniel, I will get justice for you. I will protect Matthew no matter what it costs." The next morning, the sun streamed through the hospital window, but its brightness couldn't chase away the deep chill I felt inside. I sat next to Matthew, watching him sleep soundly after the sedative. His small face looked calmer, but the indelible mark of pain was still there, impossible to erase. My phone vibrated. It was a call from the precinct. The detective's voice was grave, but now with a hint of urgency. "Mrs. Helen, we have new information. Could you come to the station right now?" I nodded, though he couldn't see me, and whispered to Matthew, "Grandma will be back in a little while. Be good. The nurse will take care of you." I entrusted my precious grandson to the young nurse I'd come to know over these past few days and hurried out of the hospital, my mind a swirling mess. On the bus ride to the precinct, I stared out the window, but saw nothing but the horrifying image of Daniel falling from Matthew's story. I clutched my shawl tightly in my hands, trying desperately to hold back the tears. When I entered the briefing room at the precinct, the lead detective, a middle-aged man with a piercing gaze, was already waiting for me. He spread a large map on the table and pointed to several red dots marked around Daniel's house. "We have a new lead," he said, his voice confident. "A neighbor's security camera recorded a suspicious truck on the night of the storm." I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. He played the video on the screen. The image was blurry and shaky due to its poor quality, but I could still clearly see a dark truck parked in front of Daniel's house. Under the dim streetlight, I could make out the shape of something long, covered with a tarp, in the back. Minutes later, this truck drove away. The detective continued, pointing to another video. "We can't see the license plates clearly, they're too blurry, but the model matches one used by a local loan shark gang." I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms. Matthew's story, Jessica, and that strange man, wrapping Daniel in a blanket, dragging him out of the house, that long thing in the truck. I didn't dare to think further, but the pain in my heart was like a sharp knife. A young officer standing beside him added, "We've already checked the recordings from nearby traffic cameras. The truck appears at a couple of points, but then we lose its trail on the outskirts. We're already coordinating with patrols to search for it." I nodded, but my head felt like it was spinning. "Are you sure that truck has something to do with it?" I asked, my voice trembling. The detective looked at me, his eyes full of determination. "It's circumstantial evidence, Mrs. Helen, but very important. We're not going to let any lead go." I felt a faint glimmer of hope, but at the same time, the fear of what they might find left me breathless. After the meeting, the detective suggested I go back with them to Daniel's house. I hesitated. I didn't want to face that place again, but I knew I couldn't run away. When we arrived, the yellow police tape was still blocking the door, a stark, painful reminder of the nightmare that had occurred. The forensics team was working inside, carefully collecting samples, taking pictures of the scene. I stood on the porch, my gaze fixed on the dried coffee stain on the living room floor, where just a few days before I had entered and found everything destroyed. That coffee stain, along with the shattered pieces of the cup, was like a scar that would never heal in my mind. Suddenly, an elderly neighbor, Mrs. Rose, approached me, leaning on her cane, and whispered as if she were afraid someone would hear her. "Helen. On the night of the rain, I heard a very loud fight at Daniel's house. Shouting, the sound of furniture moving. I wanted to call the police, but I was scared. Scared of getting into trouble." The woman lowered her head, her eyes filled with guilt. I took her hand and said with a choked voice, "Thank you for telling me. Can you tell the police now?" Mrs. Rose nodded, and I led her to the young officer. He wrote everything down carefully, thanked her, and promised to investigate further. I watched Mrs. Rose walk away, my heart heavy. I blamed myself, wondering if I had arrived sooner, if things would have been different. Before we left, the detective gave me a gentle pat on the shoulder and said in a low voice, "We're going to find that truck, Mrs. Helen. Have faith." I nodded, but inside, I didn't know if I had any strength left for hope. I left the house. The sun was shining brightly, but my heart was cloudy, as if it were about to rain. A few days after hearing Matthew's terrible story, I received another call from the precinct. The detective's voice sounded as grave as ever, but now with a hint of urgency. "Mrs. Helen, we found the address of the apartment complex where Jessica lived. Do you want to come with us?" I looked at Matthew, who was sitting on the hospital bed, hugging his teddy bear and staring out the window with a lost look. I didn't want to leave him, but I knew I had to go. If there was any clue about Jessica, about what happened to Daniel, I had to see it with my own eyes. "I'm on my way," I replied, my voice trembling. I again entrusted Matthew to the young nurse, caressed his hair, and whispered, "Grandma won't be long, Matthew. Be good. I'll be right back." The boy nodded weakly, but his gaze remained empty, as if he were in a place I couldn't reach. The alley leading to Jessica's apartment complex was in a forgotten corner of the city, where peeling walls smelled of dampness and car fumes. I walked alongside two police officers, my steps heavy on the muddy path. My heart was pounding, not from exertion, but from the chilling fear of what I was about to find. When we arrived, the building's landlady, a middle-aged woman with a sour face, was sitting at the entrance, smoking a cigarette. As soon as she saw the police, she sighed in annoyance, as if she were used to these kinds of problems. "That Jessica," she said with a dismissive voice. "She left about 2 weeks ago, handed in the key, and took off." Her words were like a physical blow to my chest. 2 weeks ago. Exactly when Daniel disappeared, when his house became a scene of chaos. I stood frozen, clutching my shawl, struggling to keep my composure. The young police officer, the tall and slim one, asked, when she left, was she carrying a lot of things? The landlady nodded, stubbing out her cigarette in an ashtray. "Yeah, a huge suitcase. She looked like she was in a real hurry, like she was running from something. Even hired some guy to drive her away at night. Didn't say anything except to pay up." Just as we were about to leave, a strange man appeared at the end of the alley. He had a rough appearance, with a worn leather jacket and a face full of scars. He approached and asked the landlady in a hoarse voice, "Is Jessica still here? I need to see her urgently." The detective stopped him immediately, his look as cold as ice. "Who are you? What's your business with Mrs. Jessica?" The man stuttered, clearly surprised, and tried to back away, but the young officer held him. After a moment of nervousness, he sighed, his voice annoyed. "I'm Ramon," he said. "Her loan shark. Jessica owes me a lot of money. She swore she'd pay me back in 2 weeks, but now she's nowhere to be found." The police and I looked at each other. No one said anything, but I knew we were all thinking the same thing. The moment Jessica fled, the moment Daniel disappeared, and now the promise of a large sum of money. It all fit together in a terrifying way. Why would she be so sure she'd have a large amount of money in 2 weeks if she was so desperate before that she had to seek out her ex-husband? The young officer muttered, almost to himself. That question was like a knife in my heart. A bad feeling grew inside me, cold and cruel, making me tremble. There was something darker behind all this, and I feared the truth was even more painful than I had already imagined. That night, I sat by Matthew's bed. The dim light from the hospital hallway illuminated his sleeping face. He was still hugging his teddy bear, as if it were the only thing anchoring him to this world. I took his hand, feeling the faint warmth of his thin fingers, and tried desperately to calm myself. But then, like a flash of lightning in the dark, a vague memory surfaced in my mind, making my heart race. Many years ago, when Daniel and Jessica were still happy, Daniel had proudly showed me a life insurance policy he had bought. "Mom, I want to protect my family," he had told me with his radiant smile. "If anything happens to me, Jessica and Matthew will have nothing to worry about." The sole beneficiary at that time was Jessica. And now, thinking about it, I realized that Daniel had never mentioned changing the beneficiary's name after they divorced. That memory was like a fresh stab in my heart. Could Jessica, with her huge debt and desperation, have set her sights on Daniel for the insurance money? I started to tremble, not from the cold, but from a horrible premonition that was suffocating me. I looked at Matthew. I saw him sob in his sleep, his lips moving to call for his dad. I couldn't stay still for another second. The next morning, I called the detective, my voice trembling. I remembered something. Daniel had a life insurance policy, and Jessica was the sole beneficiary. "Can you investigate that?" He was silent for a moment and then replied, "Thank you, Mrs. Helen. That could be a key lead. We'll go to Mr. Daniel's house right now." I entrusted Matthew to the nurse, asking her not to leave him alone, and went with the police to Daniel's house. As we entered, the yellow tape was still on the door, a chilling reminder of the nightmare. The forensics team had already left, leaving the house cold and silent. The detective took me and a young officer to Daniel's study, where he used to organize his papers. They rummaged through the file cabinet, checking every folder while I stood there, clutching my shawl, a tight knot of dread in my stomach. After what felt like more than an hour, the young officer exclaimed, "I found it." He held up a blue folder, opened it, reviewed it, and passed it to the detective. The detective glanced over it, then lightly tapped the folder against the desk, and said with contained anger, "Here it is, the motive." I looked at the paper and saw Jessica's name printed clearly in the beneficiary section. My horrible feeling was right. Daniel, out of love and responsibility, had unwittingly left the path clear for Jessica to take advantage. I sank into a chair, tears streaming down my cheeks. "Why didn't you change it, Daniel?" I whispered, my voice choked with grief and frustration. "Why did you give her the chance? The detective placed a hand on my shoulder and said gravely, "Mrs. Helen, if Daniel died in an accident, Jessica would receive all the insurance money. With that amount, she could pay off all her debts and live comfortably. This is likely the reason he disappeared." His words were like a hammer blow to my head. I clenched my fists, an immense, searing rage growing in my chest. Jessica had become a monster, willing to take Daniel's life for money. I remembered her face when she was young, when she smiled happily next to Daniel, and I wondered what could have made her change so much. Was it ambition, desperation, or was she simply a person who had utterly lost herself? That afternoon, when I returned to the hospital, the phone rang once more. It was the detective. His voice sounded even more urgent now. "Mrs. Helen, we've just received news from the investigation team. They found an abandoned frozen goods warehouse on the outskirts, a place the Lone Shark Gang uses for their illegal activities. We've already sent a special team there." I felt my heart pound like a war drum. "What do you suspect?" I asked, my voice trembling. He hesitated. "We're not sure, but it's possible that we might find some clue about Mr. Daniel." I sat by Matthew's bed, my hands shaking so much I couldn't even hold a glass of water steady. That night, when Matthew was already asleep, the phone rang again. I answered, my hand shaking so violently I almost dropped it. The police officer's voice on the other end was halting, as if he were choosing his words very carefully. "Mrs. Helen, we found a body, a man hidden in the frozen goods warehouse. We suspect it's Mr. Daniel." I collapsed into a chair, a lump in my throat, unable to say a single word. My world fell apart. Daniel, the person I loved most, was now just a body in a cold warehouse. I wanted to scream that it wasn't true, but only tears came out. "Are you sure?" I whispered, my voice broken beyond repair. "We need you to come and identify him," he replied, his voice full of pity. "But please, prepare yourself." The next morning, I went with the police to the morgue, feeling a terrible, icy fear clutching my heart. On the way, sitting in the back of the patrol car, I clutched my shawl and looked out the window, seeing nothing but Daniel's face in my mind's eye. I remembered his bright smile, the way he would playfully tease me when I burned the sweet corn cake. "Mom, if you open a bakery, I'll be your first customer," he would say, his voice cheerful and full of life. Now, that smile was just a memory. And I was about to face a truth I didn't want to believe. When the car stopped in front of the morgue, I got out, feeling like I was walking in a dream. The young police officer, the one who had been with me these past few days, put a comforting hand on my shoulder and said softly, "Mrs. Helen, are you ready?" I nodded, though inside, I knew I would never be ready for this. The door to the cold room opened, and a frigid air, smelling faintly of chemicals, hit my face, making me shiver uncontrollably. The white sheet covering the gurney was slowly pulled back, and then I saw Daniel's face. Although it was pale, although it was changed by time and death, I recognized my son instantly. His thick eyebrows, his straight nose, and the lips I had kissed so many times when he was a baby. He was still my Daniel. I burst into tears, falling to my knees on the cold floor, able to utter only 2 words, "My son." I wanted to touch him, to hug him one last time, but my hands were shaking so much I couldn't even lift them. The young police officer gently helped me up, his voice full of sorrow. "We are so sorry, Mrs. Helen. Please sit here." But I didn't want to sit. I didn't want to do anything but scream at the world, demanding to know why my son had to be gone like this. When I finally calmed down a little, the medical examiner, a middle-aged man with a grave voice, approached. He held a folder and explained, "The victim died from severe traumatic brain injury caused by a strong blow against a hard object. The time of death is estimated to be the night of the storm 2 weeks ago." His words confirmed what Matthew had told me about that terrible night when Daniel fell and lay motionless on the floor. I nodded, but every word he said was like a knife sinking deeper into my heart. "Thank you," I whispered, not quite sure why I was saying thank you. Maybe for the truth, as cruel as it was. The police didn't stop there. They immediately expanded the investigation, meticulously examining the truck that the security camera had recorded. The detective called me at noon, his voice full of grim determination. "Mrs. Helen, we found a blanket stained with red and a woman's jacket in the truck bed. The DNA results confirm the stain is Mr. Daniel's blood, and the jacket belongs to Jessica." I collapsed into a chair in the hospital hallway, my hands pressed against my chest. All the loose pieces now fit together, forming a picture of the crime so chillingly clear. Jessica had really done it. She had taken Daniel's life. Using the statement from the loan shark we found at the apartment complex, the police quickly arrested the unknown man who had accompanied Jessica that night. They invited me to the precinct to watch the interrogation from outside, through a one-way mirror. The man with the rough appearance initially denied everything, grunting, "I don't know anything. I just went with her." But when the police showed him the irrefutable evidence, Jessica's jacket and the blood-stained blanket found in the truck, his face turned pale, and he started to sweat profusely. The detective told him in a harsh, unyielding voice, "Do you think we don't know? You helped her hide the body. Talk if you don't want your sentence to be worse." Finally, desperate to get a deal, he confessed where Jessica was hiding, an abandoned house on the outskirts of the city. I stood outside the interrogation room, clutching my shawl, feeling the world spin around me. Jessica, the woman who once had dinner with my family, who laughed with Matthew, was now a fugitive, a cold-blooded killer carrying a heinous crime on her shoulders. I remembered the last time I saw her before she and Daniel divorced. She had looked at me with cold, calculating eyes. "Stay out of it, Helen. This is between Daniel and me." I had tried to stop her. I had tried to tell her that Matthew needed his mother, but she just laughed bitterly. Now, that laughter echoed in my mind like a terrifying warning I had tragically ignored. A few days after identifying Daniel's body, I received the news that the police had arrested Jessica. They caught her in a small copy shop, trying to forge documents to flee the city. The detective called me, his voice soft but firm. "Mrs. Helen, we have her. Do you want to come to the precinct?" I hesitated, looking at Matthew, who was drawing on the hospital bed, still hugging his teddy bear. "No," I replied, my voice choked. "I don't want to see her. Just make sure she doesn't escape." But in the end, as the police led Jessica down the hallway of the precinct, I watched from a distance, seeing her handcuffed, her face gaunt, her hair disheveled. I felt a confusing mix of anger and, deep down, a strange, profound pity. Jessica, who was once my daughter-in-law, who was Matthew's mother, had utterly destroyed her own life and the lives of the people she loved most. The trial took place in the city courthouse, attracting the attention of the press and the public alike. I sat in the front row, holding Matthew's hand tightly, feeling his small hand tremble in mine. He hadn't wanted to come, but I had gently convinced him. "Matthew, we have to do this for your dad. Grandma will be right here with you." He nodded, but his eyes were still filled with a profound fear. The courtroom was packed. The air felt heavy, thick with tension, like a rope about to snap. The prosecutor, a tall man with a sharp voice, stood up and presented the evidence one by one. He played the recording of Matthew's statement. My grandson's small, trembling voice recounting the horrifying night of the storm. Hearing it squeezed my heart, and I hugged Matthew tighter as he lowered his head, burying his face in his bear. The prosecutor continued, showing photos of the blanket and Jessica's jacket found in the truck. "The DNA results confirm that the blood belongs to the victim, Mr. Daniel," he said, his voice cold and unwavering. He then projected the images from the security camera, the blurry truck, under the streetlight, carrying something long covered with a tarp. Finally, he held up the life insurance policy folder, pointing to Jessica's name as the sole beneficiary. This was the motive, he declared, his voice echoing in the silent room. The defendant planned a cold-blooded murder to collect the insurance money, pay off her crushing debts, and live comfortably. I looked at Jessica, sitting in the defendant's box, her head bowed. At first, she tried to remain calm, avoiding everyone's gaze, but as the evidence mounted, she began to tremble visibly. Suddenly, she jumped up and shouted, her voice breaking, "I didn't mean to kill him. I just wanted my money." But no one in the room was moved by her desperate plea. The prosecutor approached, refuting her coldly. "If you only wanted money, why did you hide the body? Why did you stage a fake accident scene and then try to collect on a life insurance policy?" Jessica was speechless. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. She turned to her accomplice, the rough man who was with her that night, and screamed, "It was him. He pushed Daniel." The man immediately stood up, his face red with fury, and pointed a finger back at her. "You were the one who planned everything. I just did what you told me. You told me to push him, to help you hide the body." The atmosphere in the courtroom grew thick with tension. The murmurs of the crowd sounded like a rising wave. I hugged Matthew, feeling him tremble uncontrollably. "Grandma," he whispered, his voice small and full of heartbreaking guilt. "It was all my fault, wasn't it?" I stroked his hair, trying desperately not to cry myself. "It wasn't your fault, Matthew. Your mom made a terrible mistake, and she's going to have to pay for it." But inside, I knew those words, however true, couldn't heal the deep wound in Matthew's young soul. After hours of deliberation, the judge, a woman with a serious, unwavering gaze, stood to deliver the verdict. Her voice was clear and firm. The defendant, Jessica, is found guilty of first-degree murder and fraud and is sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The accomplice is found guilty of accessory to murder and concealment and is sentenced to 20 years in prison. When the sentence was read, I broke down crying, hugging Matthew with all my strength. My tears were not only for the excruciating pain of losing Daniel, but also for the overwhelming relief that justice, finally, had been served. Matthew hid his face in my chest, crying uncontrollably. And I could only rub his back, whispering, "It's over, my boy. Your dad can finally rest in peace." A few weeks later, I decided to close up Daniel's house for good. I couldn't go back to that place, which was once filled with the laughter of my son and grandson, and was now just a painful, haunting memory. I took Matthew to live with me in my small town. I enrolled him in therapy, desperately hoping that the deep wounds in his heart would slowly, gradually heal. Every night, I sit by his side, and I tell him stories about Daniel from when he was a boy, about how he always wanted me to be proud of him. "Your dad loved you so much, Matthew," I say, stroking his hair. "And Grandma does too." That night, I sat by the window with Matthew asleep in my arms. The moonlight streamed in, soft and comforting. I looked up at the vast, silent sky and whispered, "My son, I promise you, I will raise and protect Matthew for you. Justice has been served." Tears rolled down my cheeks, but in that moment, I felt a small, fragile bit of peace. As if Daniel were somewhere, smiling down at me. I hugged Matthew closer, knowing that although the searing pain of losing my son would never truly go away, I still had him, and I would spend the rest of my life taking care of him, just as Daniel would have wanted. After everything we've been through, from the bottom of my heart, I want to say to you, who have followed my story to this moment, the love and care for family should never, ever be taken for granted. A single oversight can lead to a tragedy with no turning back. Ambition and betrayal can turn your most loved ones into strangers, but justice will always speak, if you are persistent until the very end. I learned that true strength comes when you rise up to protect those you love, even in the midst of the deepest, most unbearable pain. And above all, loss taught me to value every single second together, because the love of family is the most valuable legacy we leave to the next generations. The story you have just heard has had names and places changed to protect the identities of those involved. We don't tell it to judge, but in the hope that someone will listen and stop to think about how many mothers are suffering in silence within their own homes. I truly wonder, if you were in my place, what would you do? Would you choose silence to keep the peace, or would you dare to face it all to reclaim your own voice? I would like to know your opinion, because every story can become a light that illuminates the path for others.